Welcome to another episode of Let Go and Lead, where we discuss the new realities of leadership with pioneers, provocateurs, and passionate leadership champions. My guest today is Zach Mercurio, who's an author, researcher, speaker, and sought-after consultant. Zach specializes in three fascinating areas that I can't wait to explore: purposeful leadership, meaningful work, and positive organizational psychology. He earned his PhD from Colorado State University, where he currently serves as an honorary fellow in the Department of Psychology's Center for Meaning and Purpose, and as an instructor in the Organizational Learning, Performance, and Change program. Zach is also the author of The Invisible Leader: Transform Your Life, Work, and Organization with the Power of Authentic Purpose. His research on meaningful work has been recognized by the Association for Talent Development, the Academy of Management, and the Academy of Human Resource Development. I can't wait to dig into this discussion with Zach to learn about his approach to both purposeful leadership and the importance of mattering at work. So get comfortable and get ready to let go and lead. Hi, Zach. Thanks so much for joining us on Let Go and Lead. Your work is absolutely incredible in very big areas: purposeful leadership, meaningful work, and positive organizational psychology. Woo, and that's a mouthful, and I bet it's a lot to study as well.
Yes, thanks for having me. It's a lot, but it's powerful. It's all powerful.
And we're going to learn so much about that as we dig in. So, one thing I'd love to talk about is you got your PhD at Colorado State University. And since then, you've continued to be an honorary fellow there and also an instructor. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I get to be an honorary fellow in a place that's called the Center for Meaning and Purpose. And we actually study the experience of meaningfulness and purpose in organizations and in people's lives. And I also instruct on organizational change and organizational development. So it's a perfect combination of what I'm doing, which is to help everybody realize their own significance in work and create environments of significance in work. And how do you change and transform cultures to do that, to enable that? And then the rest of my time is I'm out doing it with leaders and organizations, helping to turn these ideas of purpose and meaning into tangible, hard practices and skills. So it's a fun combination. I'm not purely in the academic realm. I get to be out there in the messiness of organizations, making this work.
As you've gotten into this work, what really led you to it?
Well, it starts with my education or miseducation, as a lot of these journeys end up as I'm reflecting with others. And, in architecture, good design is when form follows function. Yet, what I've noticed in reflecting on my own education and the education of many future leaders is that we often do the opposite with human beings. We ask people to develop the form of their life and career. What and how are they going to do, without really deeply understanding their function, why they are, what kind of impact they want to make, what strengths they have. And that tension led me into taking a job, my first job out of college, to be successful, to make money. I worked in an advertising agency, and I got to experience the tension that happens when we don't know why we're doing what we're doing, when we don't feel like we matter, and the withdrawal and the despair that can result from that. And what actually lifted me out of that experience was ordinary people with extraordinary perspectives. I was lucky to be in the world and have experiences with cab drivers and bus drivers and janitors who exude joy in their everyday work. And one of the things I noticed as I talked with them is they did not talk about what they did and how they did it. They tended to talk about their contribution, the people that they talked to. I had the cab driver, I remember him telling me he's parents that people don't talk to anymore. He's people's friends that they don't get to talk to. He's the first experience someone traveling internationally has with a country. And I had these types of experiences, and I started thinking, how do we create environments where people can understand their function, their unique strengths, understand their impact first, and then embark on whatever it is people are embarking on. And so those experiences led me to work in higher education, and then go into researching what exactly makes life and work meaningful and purposeful, and then be out helping people to translate that into practice.
And what's the background of most of the students who take your courses? What are they hoping to do?
I work with professionals. So most of the people that take my courses are graduate level who are in organizations who are coming back. And I think that if I were to categorize them, it's they sense something's not right. Right? They sense something could be better and they want to do the right thing. And they don't know how to do the right thing. They don't know how in their current environments to care. There's a for example, there's a lot of be caring leadership advice out there, but there's systems that we're operating in that make it difficult to care, that almost make it impossible to care or to lead with purpose. For example, if you're in a distribution center, every minute of every day is tracked. I tell you as a manager, you need to care more, you need to lead with purpose. The environment literally doesn't make it possible to do those things. So these are people who are really wanting to redesign systems to make all of these wonderful things we talk about, psychological safety, purposeful leadership, meaning actually possible through behavior.
I often see where companies will talk about people problems, and they're often process problems or system problems, not really people problems. Because most people, and I know you'd agree with this, is that most people want to do a great job. They just can't often, the way the whole system's set up. How do you counsel clients who want to change a system? What are you suggesting to them?
You're right. Almost all people problems are systems problems. I rarely find, for example, an unmotivated employee. I very often find employees who don't feel like they matter. For example, from an employee perspective, when someone doesn't believe that they matter, they either act out in two ways. They withdraw, also known as the quiet quitting trend, or they act out in desperation. They're difficult employees. They're searching for attention. Almost all of those things can be traced back to this epidemic of anti-mattering that we have in organizations, which we can talk about later. But when it comes to systems, one of the things that I talk about is an ecological approach to thinking about organizations, because environment does two things to human behavior. It can make behavior possible. For example, if I have a swimming pool in my subdivision, right, or where at my neighborhood, it makes it possible that I will swim. So the big question I ask is, does the environment make the behaviors you say you want possible? And then environmental determinism, which is the environment determines the behavior will occur. And that's where I want people to get that purpose, meaning, the behaviors that develop those things actually become determined by the environment. For example, if I have to pass a swimming test, and I don't know why I'm doing this example, but if I had to pass a swimming test,
Because it's summer.
yeah, if I had to pass a swimming test to live where I live, the environment would determine that I have to learn how to swim. And I think many people, they attribute issues to the individual, like something's wrong with our employees versus something's wrong with our environment. Our employees are unwell versus our environment is unwell. And we tend to take an individual versus ecological approach to issues, and we get short-term fixes like more training, or just the added like fix of let's give more benefits or let's tinker with wages without changing the underlying system. Or you try to change someone's behaviors without changing their beliefs, their underlying beliefs in a system, and that always ends up not sustaining. For example, if you go to paint a wall but you don't scrape the paint off underneath, eventually the old paint comes through. The same is true with beliefs and underlying systems. It always wins. If you put a well individual in an unwell system, they will eventually become an unwell individual. So those are some key questions that I encourage people to ask.
So talk a little bit more about the system and an unwell system. So I imagine people are listening thinking, "Okay, this is really interesting. What do I do with it?"
Yeah, yeah.
So can you give people a little more thought around that?
So, for example, in my work with making sure that people experience meaningfulness and dignity in work, meaningfulness is the experience that I and what I'm doing matters, that I experience work as positive, as purposeful, and as significant, right? And an example of the way a system can make behaviors that create that experience impossible is, for example, where are you investing your attention? How much demand on your attention as a leader is there? Let's think about leaders. So if you're expecting leaders, I think there was a recent study that came out that by McKinsey that managers spend about 28% of their time actually working with people. The rest is responding to strategic needs from above. The other big percentage is reacting to problems that come up.
An
And
email.
so an email, right? So like a
Right.
system property is attention. So do we have the attention available as a resource for our leaders to do what we need them to do? That's an example of a way you can really scan and analyze your environment. Do our leaders have the skills to do what we need them to do? One of the biggest problems with leadership that I see over the past uh, 30, 40 years is we've generally relied on people to be leaders based on intuition, but intuition doesn't scale, right? Practices and skills do. We tend to have processes and procedures for everything else in organizations, but what genuinely matters to human beings, like what is your process and procedure for noticing people? What is your process and procedure, and how do you learn to give feedback in a way that shows someone their unique strengths? How do you make sure everybody feels indispensable? So turning common sense into common set of practices and skills that can be taught, evaluated, and repeated is a system property as well. So those are two areas. What are those barriers? Do people have the ability to do it? And does the environment support them in making it possible for them to do it?
I love the idea of having a system for noticing people. What would that system look like?
Yeah, for example, like it's a skill. So we worked with a big distribution center and there were 19 teams. All of them scored very low on these engagement surveys except for one. And I love that because then I can go to the team and say, "What is happening here? Teach us,
Exactly.
teach everybody."
Yeah.
And they all said some version of on this team that was highly engaged. They said, "It's our leader. We'd do anything for her. She just gets us." So naturally, I went to the leader and I said, "What do you do?" And she said, "I haven't really thought about that," which is interesting. But then she said, "One thing I do on Friday morning," that she takes out this old moleskin notebook. And she goes, "One thing on Friday mornings, I write down all of my team members' names." She has 15 team members. She goes, "I write down a personal thing they talked about that week, whether it's they struggling on a project or a kid was starting a new sport or their family member was in the hospital." And it's just a quick line, quick note. On Monday morning, that's how I start my week. I take out the notebook, I write down that what they talked about, and then I schedule 3 minutes. She was very adamant, 3 minutes to check in with each person. That's an hour over the course of a week. I said, "That's all you do?" She said, "That's all I do." It's the power of feeling seen. But what I love about the example is I'm not asking listeners to keep a personal logbook on people, but what I'm trying to highlight is that these ideas, these intuitive ideas that we need to notice people or see people, for example, can be intentional practices. What is your practice? What is your process? What is your moleskin notebook for noticing people versus leaving it up to intuition? And then how are you teaching, evaluating, and developing those skills if you're an organization so people have the skill set to care?
Well, and what I love about that is it's creating a habit that is not overwhelming at all.
No.
I think often, and you were talking earlier about a lot of companies try to solve things through training and all these different things, and it's almost overworked to the point that nobody can really execute on it. But that's like just a very simple, practical idea. Thank you so much for sharing that. I love it.
Yeah, in our research on meaningful work, what we find is meaningfulness is not developed by an initiative or a program. It's developed and maintained through interactions. And I think great leaders are optimizers of interactions. They optimize their daily interactions and are intentional about those daily interactions. And so I think that's a great point that you bring up is the interaction between a leader and a person who's on a team is so vital. That's the fertile ground where meaningfulness develops, and it's often overlooked. Like you go on LinkedIn, you see us talking about product launches, book launches, all these big goals. When's the last time you saw someone post, "Hey, I remembered someone's full name today. Hashtag leadership." Right? But those are actually the very moments that create leadership legacies and forge trust and care and connection. And yet they're often overlooked. If I were to ask listeners right now, tell me on your to do list, like which practices are there today, actions to notice people, to affirm them, to remind people how they're needed. Often it's very hard to see that. And that's what I mean by closing this gap between common sense and common practice, which is essential for creating thriving organizations.
And let's go back a little bit to talk about purpose, because I know you do an awful lot of work around that, and it's obviously a very hot topic these days. One of the things that, of course, we're seeing as well is many companies are talking about purpose, and then there's a backlash about purpose washing. What are you seeing in that?
There is a big difference between having purpose and being purposeful.
Right.
There's some studies out of Harvard that, over 430 companies are studied, and just having a purpose doesn't have any real financial return or impact on culture. But there is a type of purpose that does, and it's called high purpose clarity. So it's where the purpose is embedded to and through the organization. So like having purpose is having this big sense of purpose. It's when people get together in the boardrooms with the branding consultant and they come up with how they're changing the world. But there's a big difference between that and being purposeful. Being purposeful is contribution centered thinking, being, and doing. It's the lens through which we show up as leaders and as organizations. It's not ornamental. So I think that that's a big distinction when it comes to purpose washing. Just like anything else, and I go back to like the philosopher Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. I know I'm getting anytime you treat a human as a means to an end, they become less human to you. So anytime you use purpose to get some self-serving end, it's really not purpose, it's a tactic. So what I ask companies to do is really think, is this purpose true? Is this the true impact that you or your product are making on people? Or is it purely aspirational? And then two, is it the end itself? Right? Is it the end itself? Is this impact the end itself and your profit exists to help you deliver more of it? And I think those are two good questions for a litmus test of whether you're washing.
I love that. How do you distinguish between purpose as a strategy versus purpose as a tactic?
Yeah, a tactic is any time you're trying to manipulate an outcome through something versus trying to actually deliver on the thing itself. So, an example is, and Andrew Carton at the Wharton School does some really great research on this. And he did a research study on NASA when they were trying to land a person on the moon by the end of the decade, which is a massive aspirational purpose. And John F. Kennedy had this big speech that says that, NASA exists to put a person on the moon by the end of the decade to advance science. Well, that's incredibly aspirational. Um, but what was powerful is that NASA, after Carton uncovered and went through archives of what they did to get 300,000 contract workers connected with that purpose, is they made it real every day. So on every blackboard in NASA facilities, there was what's called a ladder to the moon scrawled on the blackboard. It would show people how their honest, authentic task grouping met a tangible, measurable objective that met a higher order tangible, measurable objective, which would ultimately put a person on the moon by the end of the decade. And what he says and what research shows is that when you have a bigger purpose and it's embedded and people can see it and experience it every day, and every stakeholder group can see it and experience, that's where it becomes transformational. But when you have a bigger purpose and someone on the front line never thinks about it, never talks about it, never is able to connect their task to it, it can actually be destructive. There's studies that call this, it creates existential acting and actually can result in burnout and despair and withdrawal when people see a company that has a big purpose, but they don't see it in their everyday. So I love that example from NASA because when purpose becomes more than a tactic, it becomes embedded in the narrative of how people think, feel about, and do their everyday work. It's not just a statement on the wall, it's an everyday way of being.
I'm really interested in this existential acting. Is that what you called it?
Yeah, it's a
I've
study done
never
that
heard it before.
yeah, that shows that like if you tell me that my job has purpose, but I don't experience purpose, I start acting like my job is meaningful. I will start like acting as if my job was meaningful, and it takes a lot of energy to do that, and it doesn't last. And then oftentimes people start feeling shame for not experiencing their work as meaningful, and then they start blaming, and then they actually can withdraw and burn out. And what can happen is when we use meaningful work or purpose and we use them to get more out of people instead of use them to really enrich the lives of people and authentically design environments where people can see and feel it. They know that they matter. They can see how they matter. They can see in the environment the evidence of their significance. So then when I say, oh, by the way, and here's our purpose statement, it's not a surprise. An individual already feels it, they already experience it. The best test of whether you have a purposeful organization is go down to the very front line and ask them, what is the purpose of this company? And that's your purpose right now, right? That's the
Exactly.
true purpose.
It's like your brand, right? You don't decide what your brand is.
Yeah. So if you develop a purpose statement or do that, which I think is important to have those signposts for contribution, because what's in our environment is important, make sure that you're expressing what's already there. Do the work to cultivate what's already there instead of expressing what you want to be there.
One of the other things that I'd seen in watching one of your speeches that I thought was interesting is you talked about how purpose not only affects one's mood, but one's movement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories is Desiree Linden. She is the women's winner of the 2018 Boston Marathon. And it's probably the best story that shows what purpose does to our minds and our bodies because running is a predictive sport. Like, you know what you're going to do to your body, the training, your nutrition, the processes it's going to undergo, and what the output will be. It's a predictive science. And Desiree in 2018, it was miserable. I mean, you could see if you look at pictures, it's like windswept rain in Boston, Massachusetts, 43 degrees. And she said that about mile 3, like she was going to quit. Like she was done that day. And the cameras caught her doing something very peculiar for a competitive runner. They caught her actually looking back and running backwards to help this elite group of runners that was struggling against the wind and the rain. And she said in a post race interview that I decided that I was going to be done that day. I'm going to help these other runners. She went on to win the Boston Marathon. She said that after I stopped thinking about myself, started even thinking about my impact, this broader purpose, I got my legs back. Her sports psychologist, Nicole Detling, said in an interview that it's not surprising, the Semel Center for Neuroscience at UCLA finds that just thinking about our contribution can boost neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. These are the neurochemicals that control for mood, movement, and motivation. Think about what work is, for example. It's mood, movement, and motivation. And it's a key predictor. And it's not just about going out and helping more. It's about even thinking about our contribution can give us a boost of that. If I were to ask everybody listening, think about the last 7 days of your life. Think about the moment in which you experienced the most amount of purpose. You may bring to mind someone else, probably your family, your friends, and chances are you'd have to fight off a smile. That's the neurochemical effect of having an impact. I mean, we were built to contribute. Human beings were designed to contribute. It's why our brain rewards us for it. We're built to matter. We're not built just to acquire and achieve. We're built to matter to others.
And it's so interesting as I hear you talk because I think many people think of purpose as something that we know we need it, but there's no science behind it. And it's a soft thing where you're showing it's very much a science based process.
Oh, it's a hard thing. Any organization that ceases to contribute to its ecosystem dies. I mean, we are as living organisms. If we don't contribute to our ecosystem in some meaningful way, which is what purpose is. Purpose is the reason for which something is done or created or for which something exists. Purpose is our usefulness, our contribution. If we're not contributing, and I think Eleanor Roosevelt said this, right? When we cease to make a contribution, we begin to die. Like and psychologically, that's true. We know that people who languish, whether it's in work, people who experience profound levels of despair, experience that they're not contributing anymore, or they're not valued, or they don't make a difference, which leads into experiences of anti-mattering, which is the experience of not feeling significant around us, which is a key predictor of depression, anxiety, stress, withdrawal. And it's overlooked because mattering to others around us is a basic survival instinct. I would say like mattering or purpose is about as touchy-feely as eating lunch. Really, but we've
Yeah.
It really is a survival instinct, but and that's the problem with when these things become trends is they can be seen as buzzwords, right? But that would be saying like sleeping is a buzzword.
What's your advice to companies that are believing they want a purpose, but they don't know what their purpose is?
Yeah, don't try to make one up. Talk to people. Talk to people that you impact. So a great example that I have is I worked with a guy who it was the GM of a car wash, large car wash company. They make a lot of the tunnel car washing systems that we go in. It seems like, what's the purpose in that job, right? But we sat down for coffee and I remember asking him this question. What is the human problem you exist to solve? Really? And he paused for a moment and he started thinking about this and he said, Zach, no one wants to work at a car wash. And I said, tell me more about that. He's like, we hire people who just have their GEDs or they can't get any other job. And then he had this light bulb moment and he said, we have to prepare people for their future. And that became the purpose, right? That environment was existed to prepare people for their future. And here's how they made that a reality, right? Their supervisors delegate tasks by aligning the task to a personal development plan for each employee. They're developing affordable housing for their employees. Their key performance indicator is 80% retention of car wash attendants. They have never even gotten close to that, but that's their only KPI. When they've asked people why they get their car washed, they say things like, I have to get my car washed, I'm going to a funeral, or it's part of my mental health routine. So they realize that their purpose is to prepare people for the future and provide for the community. And just to show you an example of how this becomes powerful when it's embedded, I remember during the pandemic, Colorado's economy shut down, and the general manager sent me a picture, and he said, the leadership team organized a meeting without me. We knew people were going to lose their shifts, and so they created their own food bank. And he shows me this picture of food like piled up, right? And that right there is the power of purpose when it's embedded, is that it becomes the ultimate guide of our decisions, our actions, and our attitudes. But I love that because nobody would think a car wash has a purpose. They're not creating a clean water project in Africa, but they are responsible for where human beings with lives as vivid and complex and as important as our own spend a third of their waking lives. I mean, I think if you're struggling to find a purpose, I think the most impactful thing a company can do for society is to make sure that people experience dignity, meaningfulness, and mattering in the place where they spend time away from their loved ones.
And I know the point of mattering, that in fact, the US Surgeon General had come out with a study that I'm sure you saw about mattering at work. And I actually, as I remember now, you actually wrote a blog on this.
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that and this whole concept of mattering.
I had a thought during the pandemic, and it was around my work on purpose. And the thought was, can I expect someone to find their contribution if they don't first believe they're worthy of contributing? I felt like there was something missing. There was something pre-purpose that was missing. And then I started thinking, can we ask people to share their voice if they don't first believe their voice is significant? Can we ask people to soar with their strengths if they don't first believe they have strengths? And then I started digging into this and I discovered this concept of mattering, which is sort of like rediscovering that you need to sleep 8 hours a day, right? It's something so instinctual. And Gordon Flett, he's an amazing researcher, wrote the book, The Psychology of Mattering. And what I found is that mattering, really has to come first. It literally comes first. So if anybody has a child, or, well, everybody was a child, the first thing you did, researchers find, when you were born is you tilted your head upward to look to matter to someone else before you looked for food. Because if you didn't procure mattering to another human being, you wouldn't be alive. You wouldn't be here. Margaret Mead finds that the first sign of civilization was a healed femur bone. Because if we broke our femur out in the wilderness, we wouldn't be able to get to water or food, or predator would get us. But she says that because we mattered to someone else enough that they would help us heal, that it has to come first, right? Mattering is an instinct, it's a basic need, it's a fundamental human desire. And when we look at things like loneliness, experiences of despair, um, chronically low engagement, You can't expect something to matter to someone who doesn't believe that they matter. And so when the Surgeon General came out with this, especially after the pandemic, it was really natural, and it was a missing link of what we've been missing, I think, in workplaces and in organizations and in communities and in society. And it's that conscious creation of moments of mattering for people to fulfill that basic instinct.
And do you see this as the same as the concept of belonging, or do you see them related but different?
Great question. They're related but different. So, belonging is the sense of being included, feeling like you are welcome in a group. Mattering is the feeling of being significant to members of that group. So, it's a little bit different. For example, I may belong in a relationship, say I'm in a romantic relationship, I may belong in that relationship, but I may not feel like I matter to that partner. Mattering makes it easier to belong, I would say. And belonging makes it easier to experience relationships that make you feel like you matter. But actually, researchers find that one quality of relationships that actually make them beneficial to our health and well being is that they show us the evidence of our significance. They notice us, they see us, they affirm us, they name our strengths, they show us the difference that we make. They tell us that we're relied on. And again, when we don't experience relationships, the results are tragic. There was just a study done on Reddit's sub community on depression and suicide. They uh, analyzed through a computer system over 500,000 posts. 70% of them had some version of anti mattering in them. I don't matter to people around me. Nobody relies on me. I don't have any strengths. My employer doesn't want me. I got fired. And so it's, I think, a mental health and public health and organizational health imperative that we address this.
And it's just so wonderful that it's now getting so much attention.
Yeah, I think, and I think that what's hard and why it's getting attention is because when upheaval events tend to amplify people's search for meaning, a lot of people call the pandemic apocalyptic.
Yeah.
I love the word. Oh, I don't love the word apocalypse, but I love the meaning of the word apocalypse because if you go to the Greek root word, it means apocalypsis, which means to reveal. And I
Oh,
feel like,
interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
and upheaval events tend to reveal things or gaps. And I think that we're able to take a step back and collectively ask the question, do I matter? Is what I'm doing matter? People who are deemed essential are now coming back into their workplaces saying, do I feel essential? Am I treated as essential? I think in the pandemic, we realized our inherent interconnectivity. And now people are asking, wait, am I interconnected? Do I feel that way? And I think that's prompted the awareness of this very primal instinct. And I want to double down on that this is not a buzzword. It's a primal human survival instinct that is embedded in everybody's brain from 6 million years of programming.
You talked in your blog a little bit about the importance of mental health, the importance to our society, as well as really to businesses. How does all that really relate for a leader?
So, what we know is that almost 50% of people surveyed indicate they don't feel valued at work. There was a recent study that found that just 24% of employees think that their employer cares about their well-being. We know that loneliness rates, feelings of loneliness, feeling disconnected and uncared for are at higher levels than ever. Depression rates amongst workers are rising. And one of the key mechanisms for cultivating well-being and mental health is the experience of mattering, of feeling significant. And many of our workers just aren't feeling significant. And what happens when an individual experiences anti-mattering is they either usually act out in acts of withdrawal. So, like, for example, the quiet quitting trend is really a result, I think, of the collective acts of withdrawal for people who don't feel like they and their lives matter to their employers, or they result in acts of desperation. People leaving a job, people quitting. A McKinsey study found that uncaring leaders was one of the top reasons why people left a job without another in hand. But the real consequence that I'm interested in is the mental health consequence of this. Human beings spend almost a third of their lives in work. How people make meaning in work inevitably affects how they make meaning in life. And when someone doesn't experience that they matter in work, it can decrease their self esteem, their sense of self worth, their sense of belonging to society. And I think, and the U.S. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy is saying that can result in feelings of depression and anxiety and loneliness. And here's, I think, a hopeful statistic and study is that there was a study that came out and said that for 70% of people, uh, their leader, their direct manager, had a greater impact on their mental health than their doctor or their therapist,
Wow.
which is powerful.
Yeah.
And that study's from the Workforce Institute in the UK. And I think that this is important. And one way I think leaders can create conditions that enable well being is to create experiences where everybody feels noticed, affirmed, and needed and feels significant.
Well, what's wonderful about that study is that tells leaders why they matter, right?
Exactly. And one of the things I love about that study is that it can help leaders realize that, yes, I mean, they have responsibility over where human beings spend this large portion of their lives, and it makes a difference outside of their lives. And it's something that leaders can do to address the mental health crisis, which is to create mattering for people.
How much do you think a leader can impact one's sense of mattering?
This is a great question because we just finished up a study. It's going to be published soon, and we studied over 1,500 employees in 23 different industries, and we measured their sense of mattering and meaningfulness, and we measured their leaders' behaviors. And what we found is that leaders can impact in this study. They impact and account for almost 50% of whether someone experiences meaningfulness. 50%. That's half of whether someone experiences meaningfulness and the experience of mattering, which is important for meaningfulness in work, through their behaviors. And there were 6 major behaviors that we identified.
Can you recall them off the
Yeah,
top of your
yes,
head? Or no,
definitely.
that's very impressive.
Well, I mean,
Okay.
when you've been working on something for 3 years in a peer
Yeah,
review
yeah.
process, it gets entangled. So, the first is impact. So, does my leader show me regularly the upstream evidence of the impact of what I'm doing today? It's a key practice. Am I shown? And it goes back to that laddering practice we talked about from the NASA example. Is my leader doing that? That was the highest impact on mattering and meaningfulness. The second was potential. So, does my leader articulate my unique potential, offer me tasks and assignments and a career development path that aligned with my unique strengths? Not blanket development. This is specific individualized development. The third is connections. And this is big. That one of the top items that we analyzed that had a huge impact on mattering was, does my supervisor ask me about what's going on in my personal life? This challenges the whole notion that what's personal is personal, what's business is business. That has pervaded what we're doing. But being able to take an interest in somebody and being able to develop relationships is important. Uh, the next one is freedom. Do I have autonomy in my
Mhm.
tasks and in what I'm doing? And then another one that's interesting is beginnings. What's the start of my time at the organization like? So, what we find is that people who were asked about their purpose or their values when they first started with the organization experienced more long term meaningfulness and mattering. So, I think I hit them: impact,
Yeah, you did.
potential, connection, freedom, beginnings, all very critical. Oh, and the last one is integrity. So are my leaders actually acting in alignment with what they state? So if my organization states a purpose, do my leaders act in a way that expresses that purpose routinely?
That's really an interesting synopsis, and it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, I think any of us who were hearing that would say, "Yeah, I can certainly see why that would make a difference." You talked a lot about meaning and matter, and I'm probably geeking out a little bit on you here, but what is the difference between meaning and matter?
I'll throw in purpose in there too for you
Okay,
if you want
good.
to.
No, thanks.
Yeah, it's helpful. I think it's fun. I think it's actually it's such a great question because it's so important to care for anything, we have to understand it. So to care for like creating matter, we have to understand what it is. And so I think that when we think about let's think about purpose. Purpose is the reason for which something is done or created. It's your contribution, how you use your strengths to make a difference. It's one input into what makes work meaningful because meaningfulness now is the experience of your work or what you're doing as positive, purposeful, and significant. So, purpose is the reason why you're doing something, your usefulness. Meaningfulness is the overall experience that what I'm doing is positive, purposeful, and significant. So, it's one input into that. And mattering is the experience of significance to other people. So I feel like I'm significant to you. You show me my significance. It's really interpersonal. And it's a key input into meaningfulness. So think of meaningfulness here. Think of purpose, mattering as key inputs into the holistic realm of meaningfulness, which is I experience myself and what I'm doing as positive, purposeful, and significant.
That's really helpful. Thank you. And it does really make sense in terms of how we see it all relating. So let's talk about your book, The Invisible Leader. It's your subtitle is Transform Your Life, Work, and Organization into the Power of Authentic Purpose. What's that all about? And what's an invisible leader?
Yeah, so Mary Parker Follett, in the late 1920s, she's a really prescient management thinker. She said leaders and followers are both following the invisible leader, the common purpose. And what she went on to talk about, and just as we mentioned the story of Desiree Linden, that actually having a firm sense and a unifying contribution to our lives and our organizations can actually be the most effective leader in our lives and organizations. It's like what motivated the behavior of those managers at the car wash to create that food bank? It wasn't somebody telling them to do it, it was the purpose telling them to do it. So the book is really about how do you, as a person and as a leader, create a sense of that bigger contribution, put your ego aside and let the contribution take over, especially in organizations, the common sense of contribution. How do you let that become the boss of your decision making, your attitudes, your actions, your behaviors? And it's really about starting with that bigger contribution and creating a culture that shows people the evidence that they do contribute. So, purpose is the invisible leader.
So as you've looked at that, you also had found that people following that invisible leader have 4 times more likely to be engaged, they're more efficient, motivated, learn faster, they're more fulfilled. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I'll give you an example. So, one of the studies that we did was with janitors at a university. And we asked all of them, and we embedded ourselves with this group of janitors, cleaners for a year and a half. And we were trying to figure out what made work purposeful and meaningful for them. And we asked this question: think about the time in your work when you most experienced meaningfulness, whatever that means to you. And there was one janitor, Ellen, who said, "Oh, it's when I clean the bathrooms on Monday morning after the weekend in the dormitories." Sounds disgusting. But she said, every time I go in there, because it's a task that I hate doing, I say to myself, I'm cleaning this bathroom so that these kids don't get sick. And that so that mentality is what is crucial to experiencing purpose, right? And she also has hats that she crochets for all of the students in her residence halls and dormitories, because she says that in the winter, if just one student's wearing her hat, she's reminded of why her job exists. So when it comes to like this invisible leader, right, the power of purpose to transform on an individual level, it can take any task and adding that so that to it can harmonize how you think about a task. Now take that janitor, Ellen, and George, who's there just to get to Friday. Imagine that they both face the same stressful situation. Who do you think is going to respond better? Right? Probably the person who has the so that. And when we have that so that, it's the grand storyline of our lives. It's why Angela Duckworth finds in her work on grit that having an other-centered sense of purpose is a key predictor of grit scores. It's why in every session on resilience, a key resource is purpose and meaning. And it's no surprise that an individual who has that is more engaged in their work, or learns faster, which research finds. Or National Institutes of Health finds that people with that sense of live on average 7 years longer in controlled studies. But when you really break it down, it's not that surprising. And that's why purpose works. It's the grand storyline. You're not stressed to be stressed. You're stressed so that something else, so that you can continue making this contribution. And it's a buffer against the challenges of life and work.
One of the other blogs that I read that I thought was really interesting was around to become a better leader, change the way you see people. And you talked about, seeing people instead of seeing problems and the story of your son Jax. Are you comfortable sharing that with us?
Yeah, so my son Jax, he was born with a facial difference. So his eyelids are malformed, and his eyes are much smaller than other people's eyes. And so frequently we'll go to playgrounds, and people will, first thing they will do is they'll ask him, what's wrong with your eyes? Why are your eyes so weird? Really difficult to hear, right? But one of the things that we did was we read R.J. Palacio's book Wonder, and it's about a child who has a facial difference. And there's Augie, who is the protagonist. At the end of this children's book, the last line is that I realized that I can't change the way I look, but maybe people can change the way they see. And I started looking into this when it comes to leaders, because oftentimes I would hear leaders saying things like, oh, that person's just there for a paycheck, or that person's always late, or that person's disgruntled, or that person's loud. And then I started reading some of the German philosopher Goethe's work, who said, how we see somebody is how we treat them. How we treat them is who they become. And I started digging into this. And for example, if you see somebody as just there for a paycheck, you'll inevitably treat somebody as if they're just there for a paycheck. And then they become someone who's just there for a paycheck to you. And you get in the see, treat, become loop. And I was seeing this with my clients over and over again. I had a person who was managing a line for a manufacturing facility, and he was talking about this woman who was always absent. And I said, well, how do you see her? And he's like, well, as someone who's always absent, always late. Tell me how you treat her. Well, I tell her she has to be on time. Well, what does that do? It produces shame, low self-worth. We know that the research on low self-worth finds that they're less likely to input effort. And so you are then becoming complicit in creating the very behaviors you say you don't want. So how we see people is different. I said, what if you saw that person as a potential contributor, as a mother, as a sister that they are, and treated them accordingly? And we had a radical conversation, right? It wasn't, why are you absent? It was like, what's going on in your life? What's making it harder for you to get here on time? How can I help? And he tried that, and it transformed that relationship. She went 2 weeks without missing a shift. So we have to think about, if we want to treat people better, if we want to care better, if we want to create mattering for people, we also have to take a step back and look at critically, how are we seeing our people? If we see people as just a resource, we'll treat them as such. If someone feels replaceable, they'll act replaceable. So I'm glad you brought that up, because it's a key reflection point for all leaders: is how you're seeing people affecting you, affecting how you treat them. And again, that last line was, I can't change the way I look, but maybe people can change the way they see.
What is now on your mind? Like you've you've done so many amazing things, researched so many things. What's next?
We're working on a study of what meaningfulness is, what mattering is like, and where it comes from. We're trying to develop a theory of what creates mattering in someone's life and in their work. And so we can give some really good data for practices for leaders to use to scale that. And we're also coming off of this study, and I'm really excited because, everybody said for a long time that leaders have a big, people don't leave organizations, they leave leaders. And that's all fine and good, right? Until you look at 1,500 people, and half of whether they experience meaningfulness as a human being, their leader is responsible for. I think that what that can do, that type of data, is it can help actually raise self-esteem amongst leaders to say that it's not just a job. I actually do have a profound impact on human beings' lives. And I think that that's a huge gap that needs to be filled. I think a lot of leaders say, I'm just here for this, or leaders themselves don't feel like they matter. And so they act as if they don't matter. And one of the key causes of toxic cultures is actually not high self-esteem amongst leaders. It's actually low self-esteem, researchers find. And so we're hoping that this data will help breed awareness, but then we're also hoping that some of our other studies and other work in organizations will help people identify tangible practices and processes they can implement to make sure this occurs. There are some things that you can do, like that are as tangible as your financial strategy, that can help you to care about people better in your environment. And I think that that's actually empowering and hopeful message versus everybody's leaving uncaring leaders. I don't think that, like that McKinsey study, I don't think that there's any leader in the world, hopefully I'm right, that says, "Hey, I'm going to wake up today and be an uncaring person." Right? I think that our systems, our lack of ability, our practices, what drives our attention away, that's what manifests in uncaring behaviors. So, I'm really just trying to help people become the leaders that they want to be, that they really want to be.
The last question I really want to ask you about is, the podcast, of course, is called Let Go and Lead. What do you think of that concept?
Oh, well, I think it's huge because if we want people to feel like they matter, we have to let go of our authority. We have to bring people in. We have to invite people in. We have to recognize people's strengths, use people's strengths from the front line all the way up. And I think, that question of, I think you in a pre-show sheet said, what do leaders need to let go of? And I think they need to let go of this sense of, I have to have the answers. I have to be in control. Because what that actually does is while you think you may be creating an environment that is best for people, to bring out the best in people, you have to ask them to help you. Humans are optimized when they feel needed. And what I mean by that is if you think about like what a parent can do, like physically, what a caretaker of someone who's ill can do and endure. Human beings are optimized when they're needed. And I think that taking that same spirit and making sure that people feel needed requires you to let go and allow people in.
Thanks again, Zach. This was absolutely incredible. You gave us so many ideas. And of course, I'm recommending to all our listeners that they get your book, The Invisible Leader: Transform Your Life, Work, and Organization with the Power of Authentic Purpose. And they can go to your website, right? ZachMercurio.com for your blog and many other resources. So thank you. And let's keep letting go and leading.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all the work that you're doing.
We covered so much ground in my conversation with Zach. The whole idea of mattering was a central part of our discussion and a concept I think is really essential for leaders to understand. He said that mattering is the most important thing to every individual, that we're literally born needing to matter to other human beings. He said that mattering is the most important thing to every individual, and that we're literally born needing to matter to other human beings. He said mattering is a primal human survival instinct that's embedded in everybody's brain from 6 million years of programming. When people feel that they don't matter, their self-esteem suffers, they withdraw, and they can have feelings of depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Because people spend almost a third of their life at work, it's important for leaders to fulfill this basic human instinct by consciously creating moments that show people how they matter. Zach cited multiple research studies throughout our conversation to support his ideas, including data from a soon-to-be-published study that found that leaders can impact and account for almost 50% of whether someone experiences meaningfulness and mattering in their work. His research identified 6 key behaviors that leaders can take to impact people's sense of mattering. First, show the upstream evidence of the impact they're making. Second, articulate their unique potential and offer a career development path that aligns with their unique strengths. Third, make a personal connection and ask about what's going on in their life. Fourth, give people freedom and autonomy in their work. Fifth, ask people about their purpose or values when they first start with the organization. And finally, act with integrity, and in a way that's aligned with their expectations. We also talked about the motivating power of having a shared sense of contribution and purpose. He said human beings are innately designed to contribute, so deliberately rewarding their individual contribution is one of the most powerful ways to motivate people. Being purposeful as a leader requires cultivating what's already authentic to the organization and designing a culture and experiences where people can see and feel how their own contribution really matters. Finally, as I do with all my guests, I asked Zach what we should let go of to be better leaders. He said we need to let go of our authority and our sense of needing to be in control. He said that if we want people to genuinely feel like they matter, we need to make sure they know they're needed and that they can help us. That requires leaders to purposefully make the time to authentically connect with everyone on their team and listen to their ideas and input. I learned so much in this discussion with Zach about the important role that leaders can play. I hope this discussion inspires all of us to make a point of showing the people we work with that we care about them as humans and that their contribution has real meaning. Remember, don't forget to subscribe so you'll be notified when we release another episode. A few of the other pioneers and thought leaders we're speaking with this season include Amy Edmondson, Sally Jenkins, Ann Powell, and Scott Snook. Thanks for joining us, and see you on the next episode of Let Go and Lead.